We're live.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I am the president of the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. On behalf of the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom, I invite all of our viewers for our monthly feature called Speaking Up Series Oration. Good morning to everyone from United States and good day from everyone amongst our audience who have joined from other countries. Let me give you a brief introduction about ICHRRF. ICHRRF is the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. It's a US-based nonprofit focused on upholding human rights and religious freedom through continuous monitoring and policy interventions and collaboration. We are focused on educational, research, legal, human rights, advocacy, and charitable purposes, and strive to be an advocate for the human rights and religious freedom of underrepresented communities across the entire world. We believe that humankind can no longer afford to be selectively vocal about the rights of only specific set of people. A humane and just world necessitates fair treatment of all living beings. Our focus is on the rights of indigenous communities and freedom, free speech, and their cultural preservation. In a sense, we are the voice of people for whom no one wants to speak. Some of our initiatives include monitoring violations of the freedom and sanctity of religious and philosophical minorities across the world, research into documentation of the culture, history, and challenges faced by such communities, policy recommendations on human rights, religious diversity, and pluralism to international organizations, agencies, national and local governments, supporting collaboration to support the cultural and philosophical diversity across the world. And I am very pleased to say that from beginning of this year, we have Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights since January 1st of 2022. This is the logo of the Commission. Today, we will be discussing human rights violations in Ukraine. And of course, this is the map of Ukraine. And these are the colors of Ukraine. Our esteemed speaker for today's Speaking Up series oration is a very distinguished person, Professor Ved P. Nanda. And of course, you'll be seeing him pretty soon. This is his picture. Professor Ved Nanda is a very illustrious academic and researcher. He's a reputed US-based professor of international law, and he will shed light on the human cost of this conflict from his legal perspective. Professor Nanda is Distinguished University Professor and Thompson G. Marsh Professor of Law at the University of Denver. He serves as Director Emeritus of the International Legal Studies programs there. In 2006, Professor Nanda was honored with the founding of the Nanda Center for International Law. He also served as the Vice Provost of University of Denver from 1994 to 2008. He holds or has held numerous official positions in international, regional, and national professional and civil society organizations. And I may add, He is a member of the board of directors of the ICHRRF, and he has the distinction of being the first chairperson of the International Advisory Board of the ICHRRF, and serves very ably by giving numerous suggestions to the ICHRRF. He is very widely published. He has authored or co-authored more than 24 books in various fields of the international law. For his public service, legal scholarship, and contributions to human rights, Professor Nanda has received a number of awards, including the Padma Bhushan Award, Gandhi Award, King Award, and Ikeda Award for community peace building. I'm not going to spend too much of time trying to introduce Professor Nanda because he does not need any introduction. Before I give floor to him, there are some housekeeping rules to the audience. Kindly mute yourself to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. Please do not interrupt our distinguished speaker while he is speaking. All the questions will be taken only after our distinguished speaker is done with his lecture. Please send your questions by the chat function. Please be very precise and brief in asking your questions. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves on the video camera will be allowed to ask questions. We do not allow anonymous questionnaires. Lastly, we are recording this event and it will be available subsequently on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So without further ado, I am deeply honored to give the floor to Professor Ved P. Nanda, an illustrious, distinguished professor and academic, and a mentor for ICHRRF. Professor Nanda, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Adityanji, for your very kind words, and I appreciate them. Also, I am deeply honored to be working with you and this august body that has undertaken a very, very worthwhile cause, that of human rights. So I deeply appreciate what you have done. Today, I'm going to start with very brief introduction to human rights as such, because human rights ought to be seen just as human dignity. And as you go back to Indian history, from the very beginning, this culture in India has prized human dignity above all. And it's not simply in India, but all over the world, human dignity is prized, human dignity is valued, and human rights are the ones that are intrinsic, inherent. They're not given by anybody, not any constitution, not any government, not any international body. They are inherent. Because I'm a human, I have got those rights. And what are those rights? Rights not only are there civil and political rights, not only economic, social, and cultural rights, but there are duties that go along with those rights. And I think it's in the same coin and both sides. One is rights, the other is duties. And human right is a very, very powerful and robust idea. This is an idea that over the period of time has stirred humanity. It has created transformation of political, economic, and social lives. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on human rights as such, but simply want to say that the current movement of human rights began after the Second World War. Second World War that brought about destruction, devastation all over the world. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people killed, totally lost their properties, cities destroyed, and with death and destruction came an understanding that those countries that violate human rights, they are in the international community outlaws. They are the ones who cause a great deal of problem, and therefore human rights ought to be protected. And that is where the United Nations began that. Now today, when we talk about human rights in Ukraine and violation of human rights, we are not talking about these civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Those of you who have been to Ukraine, and I have had the privilege of being there several times, human rights violations have continued in Ukraine because what has happened is a whole lot of corruption at times and not rule of law being totally cared for. But we're not talking about that. Today, we are going to discuss for a very short period of time, beyond these rights, human rights, atrocity crimes, violation of dignity to an extreme. And these atrocity crimes are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. And as I begin talking about it, very briefly, I want to mention that war crimes and crimes against humanity, how do we find whether they are committed or not? Because today we have got treaties starting in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, when it was quite evident that wars create a whole lot of misery, human toll, economic toll is enormous. And there were at least efforts made to see that war becomes not humane. You can't really think of sanity of war and humanity. But the point simply is that even if they are killing people, and war means that you are going to be doing that kind of violence, that there ought to be some limits. And those limits that were put together were in Geneva Conventions and in conventions from Vienna. And one of those Vienna conventions simply was that there are some kind of instruments, some kind of weapons that you don't need to use because they cause unnecessary suffering. And Geneva Conventions were that not simply those weapons, but there are parts of humanity that ought not to be touched by these. They are non-combatants. They are civilians. They are prisoners of war. And so today we do have Geneva Convention. We've got the Vienna Convention. These are treaties that countries have accepted. And there are now still customary international law that countries over thousands of years have followed certain practices. And those practices over a period of time become accepted by all countries and they become a custom, not simply a usage, but a custom. And so today we do have war crimes, crimes against humanity. And let me very briefly mention what are those war crimes. War crimes are that you don't willfully kill civilians, indiscriminately kill civilians. You don't starve civilian population by blocking food and humanitarian assistance. That you do not destroy property unnecessarily. That there are at times claims made that we needed it for military purpose and it has a reason that it had been destroyed, but indiscriminate destroying property. Then you also ethnic cleansing, using banned weapons that cause indiscriminate suffering. And that is really where today, as we look at Ukraine, we can find that those things have happened. War crimes in Ukraine after Russia came in on February 24 of this year and started aggression because unprovoked violence being used. When Russia came and used its force in order to kind of conquer, in a way, Ukraine, because it wanted to see that it would simply dislodge the current government and have its own supporters put in place to rule the country. Anyway, Russia did not succeed in all that. But the point simply would be, how do you find the evidence that these crimes have been committed? And today what has happened is that in Ukraine, you have got the International Criminal Court, you've got the United Nations bodies, the Human Rights Council, you've got at the present time Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, many other non-governmental organizations, along with international organizations, along with Ukraine itself, and the United States also has been helping in order to see that there is evidence of those war crimes. And today, this is a digital age. You've got cell phones, you've got video recordings, you've got the possibility of getting all those photos, interviews by people, and you've got intelligence available. And so today, in Ukraine, from international organizations to countries themselves, to non-governmental organizations, to individuals who are also trying to get some kind of evidence put together. So there is plenty of evidence today that you have. And is there a precedent for trying these war crimes? And the precedent began with Nuremberg. After the Second World War, at Nuremberg, those Nazi criminals who had been responsible for the war of aggression, they were put on trial. And after that, it's not simply that, but you have had in Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, you had the Hague Tribunal, Yugoslavia War Tribunal, you had Rwanda Tribunal, you had Bosnia Tribunal, and then nobody is immune, because the point simply is that even the highest officials, presidents of countries, and you have got examples from Serbia, Milosevic, from Sudan, from Liberia, and so war crimes also play a very, very important role. What do they do? If you have those trials, they serve important goals. They hold the perpetrators accountable, they punish the guilty, they end impunity for past violations, they prevent future violations. So war crimes trials are important. At the present time, you probably have seen that Ukraine itself also has conducted some war crimes trials and has already punished some people, giving evidence, and evidence that is very clearly and unequivocally present. And based upon that, they have already punished some people. I have here examples, numerous examples from international organizations, especially the United Nations. It had set up a commission to investigate possible war crimes in Ukraine. And it has now put together plenty of evidence. UN's Geneva-based Human Rights Council also has been investigating. And today the evidence is not simply from around Kyiv because you have heard about Bucha. This is the city where after the Russians left, because there was a counteroffensive by Ukraine. And in that city, they found graves that were they exhumed bodies. People had been shot with their hands tied behind their backs. Willful killing of civilians was quite evident, and the civilian infrastructure was attacked. Looting of property was all around. And as you probably have heard about it, schools, churches, places where people had gathered for entertainment, and all those kind of civilian places had been targeted by Russia indiscriminately. The question has arisen, have the Ukrainians also not committed those crimes? Who is going to follow and who is going to take care of them? And then there are people who have criticized and said that, this is really double standard. Haven't these crimes been committed by the United States, by Western countries? And the point being raised is the United States went into Iraq. And when invasion of Iraq occurred, in Afghanistan also, using all those weapons and targeting civilians at times. And the point simply is that you cannot simply say that because the United States had not been brought to trial, United States officials, therefore we should not do that in Ukraine either. I don't think that logic prevails. So at the present time, what has happened is that International Commission, United Nations organizations, and Russia has denied all that. It has said that it's not even a military aggression, it is a special military operation. And the purpose is to disarm and denazify Ukraine. And you probably also have seen that in that part where, in the east part of Ukraine, separatists, they have now tried 2 British nationals and 1 from Africa. And these are 3 people that have been, he was from Morocco, and they have been given death sentence. And the United Nations has said that there is a very clear indication that those people who are fighting, these are prisoners of war. You do not try prisoners of war. And that is where Geneva Convention simply says that prisoners of war, they are to be treated humanely, and as the war ends, they need to be free. So at the present time, as I mentioned, there are all kinds of evidence being collected. Next question that comes up is, where should you try them? Should you try them in each country? Should those war crimes be tried by an international tribunal? And what international tribunal? Because the International Court of Justice, that is the World Court in The Hague, it does not have any jurisdiction over these kind of crimes. It has jurisdiction over only states. Only countries can bring cases, and country against another country. And then there is the International Criminal Court. And International Criminal Court is the one that does have jurisdiction over both war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because I talked about war crimes, but I did not talk about the crime against humanity. And crimes against humanity are those crimes that are committed not simply as a part of war, and they include murder, torture, sexual violence, and these crimes have also been used as the basis of charges against the Nazis in Nuremberg. Genocide, though, requires a showing of intent, and the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And in Ukraine, I think President Zelensky used the term genocide. Others have used the term genocide, but I would consider that as simply a political statement, because you cannot show that there is evidence that Russia tried to destroy in whole or in part national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And you've got to show intent to do that. And that is a very, very high threshold. And I don't think that at the present time we can show that that has happened in Ukraine. But war crimes and crimes against humanity, both of them can be tried, and they can be tried by International Criminal Court. Now, Russia has not accepted the jurisdiction of International Criminal Court. And Ukraine also did not accept, but Ukraine finally had accepted that on its territory, if any of those crimes are committed, then jurisdiction can be given to the International Criminal Court. So International Criminal Court can try war crimes and crimes against humanity, but it cannot try beyond that anything. And that means that it cannot try aggression. If the charge is that Russia came and unprovoked aggression is the one that it used, then who should try that? International Criminal Court cannot, the World Court cannot. And so the thought here is that maybe a special tribunal can be created. The United Nations has the mandate under its charter to create any kind of body that would be meeting the purpose and objective that the United Nations has. And the United Nations' major objective is maintenance of international peace and security. And under that rubric, the United Nations can then start a tribunal specially to try aggression. Or also there can be a possibility that countries can, like-minded countries can get together and they can try a tribunal, because that is what had happened after the Second World War. It was Russia, it was United States, it was Britain, later on also France, and they are the ones that created the tribunal that tried the Nazis. And so I think the possibility of any of those tribunals is there. I did not give you the evidence because it's pretty grim, because exhuming all those bodies from grave, finding people in the street, simply those corpses lying with their hands tied and being killed. So I think I'm going to leave that part out, but I want to take a new issue today. And that is that not only has there been an economic toll, has there been a human toll, but there is environmental toll. And the question simply comes that the kind of environmental destruction, degradation that is happening in Ukraine, is there any possibility that you can use that in human rights terms to have some charges against Russia for doing that? And here I want to bring to your attention that in the last 1 year, both in the Human Rights Council, in the International Court at The Hague. Environmental issues have been considered as human rights issues. Human right and the environment, there has been a linkage between them, and that linkage has always been there. But recently, today, that linkage has been recognized by the United Nations, and there is a hope that in the years to come, that there might be a treaty about violation of environmental rights as violation of human rights. And therefore, because you can easily see that if the environment is not right, health, the very life itself of humanity, of human beings, it depends upon environmental not purity, but so that there is no environmental degradation. So at the present time, what has happened? What has happened in Ukraine is that the military equipment has been destroyed. There's ammunition, there are exploded missiles, there are air bombs, they are polluting the soil, they are polluting groundwater with chemicals, including heavy metals. And with all that, you can see Ukraine, there is a special setting there. It has got 15 nuclear reactors. It has got more than 600 chemical, petrochemical, pharmaceutical enterprises. It has got 48 coal mines. And what has happened not simply on the east part of Ukraine, but also when Russia came in Kiev, in the southern part, in the north, then all kind of that environmental destruction has happened. Now I'm looking at the numbers of explosive devices, aircraft bombs, explosives, and all that were used. And at the present time, there is evidence again that it has got environmental damage, and the damage has reached to the extent where today the evidence is there. These are environmental networks, international organizations, and they have done a whole lot of work there. They have done source information, satellite images, there are government bulletins, there are media reports, and piecing together, there is evidence of that environmental destruction. Now, what has happened is that International Commission, this is the International Law Commission. It is a body of experts in international law from many countries, selected, but then elected at the United Nations countries that are going to constitute the International Law Commission. And these are international law experts who twice a year meet in Geneva, and they take on some issues pertaining to our own humanity that have got a bearing in law and bearing in international law. For example, international waterways. For example, torture treaty. All these kind of things that are at the present time having a bearing upon all our lives. International Law Commission is the one that works on them. And for the last 9 years, it has been working on possible treaty. And it's possible treaty on international environmental law. It's called Protection of the Environment in Relation to Armed Conflicts. It's PERSC, and they have identified 28 principles at the present time. They are draft principles, and they are clarifying the legal framework, wide array of topics that have covered, from environmental protection duties, from the occupation, post-conflict assessment, conducting hostilities, state accountability, and at the present time, these are not to be considered to be totally binding upon anybody. They are simply in the normative stages, formative stages, in order to create some kind of norms, some kind of laws that can be there in order to see that for environmental destruction itself, that in the days to come, that we can have the country held accountable. Now the question is, what about Ukrainian violation of human rights, violation of these norms and principles by Ukrainian forces? And there is at the present time a very clear indication that the Ukraine government has been asked itself to conduct inquiries, to find the people who might have committed those crimes, to try them, because the International Criminal Court also does not try a case until the government itself is unwilling or unable to try those people. And so at the present time, let me conclude, because I had promised Adityanji that by 8:40 I should be done, so that we can have plenty of time to talk. I did not go into any details, and so let me sum it up. Initially, I simply mentioned that violations have reached an extreme. They are not civil and criminal, civil and political and economic, social and cultural issues, but they are atrocity crimes. They are war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, not genocide, but these crimes. And so then I said, is there evidence? And I mentioned that at the present time, evidence is being collected, and whatever evidence is available, it is seen very clearly that these crimes have been committed by the forces, the Russian forces at the present time. And where can be tried? They can be tried if there is evidence, and evidence is there. They can be tried by the International Criminal Court. They can be tried by municipal courts. Ukraine itself, it has got 15,000 cases that it has put together. Its own lawyers have been working on it. The United States has helped. Europe is helping. Non-governmental organizations are helping in order to get that crime. And as I mentioned, in this digital age, there is no dearth of possible instruments providing ample evidence at the present time that those crimes have been committed. So crimes evidence is there, tribunals are there, but there are two issues. One, environmental crime, and we don't know at the present time how far we can succeed at this stage, but I think in a formative way at the present time, I think these seeds are being sowed. And tomorrow probably we'll be able to move in that direction as well. Second, crimes by Ukraine itself. And on that, the effort is that Ukraine itself ought to do it. International Criminal Court has been asked also that not only should they look at the crimes committed by Russia, but if there are crimes committed by Ukraine military, they also ought to be tried, if not by Ukraine, by the International Criminal Court. So I think I conclude here by saying that unfortunately, human toll, economic toll, environmental toll is enormous at the present time. There's death and destruction. Infrastructure is totally destroyed. So the rebuilding of Ukraine and rebuilding or taking care of all that environment is going to take a huge amount of money, huge amount of time, huge amount of human and economic toll again. So I think I conclude here, Adityanji, we can take any questions, and I'll be happy to respond to any question.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Nanda, for a very detailed, expose on human rights violations in Ukraine in the current war situation, keeping in mind the international laws and international treaties. Before I go to audience questions, I have a couple of questions of my own.
Please.
And I would start with those. In a situation, if an international tribunal is created to document and prosecute the war crimes in Ukraine, what should be the date we should be focusing on? Should it be February 24, 2022? Or should it start from the time when there was a CIA-inspired coup against a duly elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2014? So should we have an arbitrary deadline of 24th February, or should such a tribunal take a longer view? And that is important because wars do not start suddenly. There's always a background, there's always issues going on. What is your suggestion? What date should we use to investigate these crimes?
Well, it has to be 2014, and not simply the CIA and what happened, but also 2014 when Russia came into Crimea. So I think all that needs to be done. When you talk about Ukraine, the entirety, not 2024, and not this February 24 of this year. No issue about that.
Thanks a lot. You did mention Russian invasion of Crimea, but also such a tribunal should consider and keep under purview the Maidan Revolution, which was clearly inspired. There are recordings of Victoria Nuland, talking to Jeffrey Pite, the American diplomat there, trying to discuss the basically American-inspired coup. So should the Maidan
I mentioned that. I'm sorry to interrupt you. No issue about that. I mentioned Crimea simply because you hadn't mentioned it, but the CIA and coup, all that's part of it. So 2014, not simply Crimea, but that and all that has to be part of it.
My second question is that since 2014 onwards, there have also been allegations of human rights violations of Russian-speaking citizens of the state of Ukraine by Ukrainian government. In fact, the current government of Ukraine has not been very democratic. There was total banning of any media, total news ban. Opposition-controlled newspapers, TV stations were banned, stopped. Journalists were ousted. Politicians belonging to those parties in Donetsk and Oblast region were quite, subjected to atrocities. Now, such an international tribunal, should it take cognizance of Zelensky government starting in 2019 with international support in persecuting and traumatizing Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of Ukraine?
If there is evidence of that, why shouldn't that be taken into account? But that persecution does not justify tying hands and killing civilians indiscriminately. It doesn't justify what Russia is doing at the present time. So you are simply pointing out that there might have been crimes committed by Ukraine, and should they not be included? Absolutely. There is no issue about all that. When you talk about the atrocity crimes, they were not atrocity crimes. in the eastern part, all that I have read and all that I have studied, there were persecution, not persecution of indiscriminately killing them, not persecution of indiscriminately destroying property, not persecuting to the extent of having this torture. So the point simply would be that surely all those possible crimes have to be investigated, have to be tried, have to be held accountable, those people who have committed those crimes. But, journalists not being permitted to enter and all those violations, as I mentioned, civil and criminal, not criminal, civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights. They are there. Many countries, unfortunately, they are not taken into account. They are not taken into consideration about all those violations. And in every country they happen. But yes, they ought to be taken into account if they have amounted to having committed those kind of atrocities. And if there are those atrocities, there may not be war crimes, but they are crimes against humanity. And any time there is a crime against humanity, whether it has been committed by the Zelensky government, whether it has been committed by the United States, in Ukraine, all of them need to be tried.
I'm glad with the even-handed answer that whoever has committed the crimes, that entity or that body needs to be, held accountable. One is not justifying one for the other, but having an even-handed approach and not selectively prosecute one type of crimes by one entity and not by another entity. The next question that is in the chat function.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the point simply here would be that they have to be war crimes, crimes against humanity, and those are the crimes that are going to be tried, not the crime on civil and political rights violations.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It needs to be investigated.
atrocity crimes. Yeah. If
Atrocity
on the
by
east side against the Russian speakers, not simply that they were denied speaking Russian, not that they were denied to having education there, but atrocity crimes. What were crimes against humanity? And if crimes against humanity occurred under the Zelensky government on the east part by Ukrainian government, they must be tried. But we are talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I'll go to the next question, which is in the chat function. And actually, you have answered this question anyhow already, but for sake of this question comes from Dr. Gaurav Shah. And he is saying, don't you think United States and some others are responsible for this conflict, not only to blame Russia for this catastrophe? So basically, again, hinting at other extraneous factors. You have already answered that, but since the question has been put, I'm just presenting it.
I think, again, the question simply would be that these are political issues, and obviously there ought to be some kind of accountability for that, but that is not a war crime, and it's not a crime against humanity, and it's not a crime of aggression. Those are the crimes that we've been talking about, because violation of human rights, if you start violation of human rights and to take action against them, what kind of action? And as at the present time, they say that hamam mein sab nange. How many countries are there that at the present time can say, gee, I'm above all this? It has never happened in my country. We have never tried intelligence officials doing these kind of dirty tricks. So I think the point simply is that today we're talking about crime against humanity and war crimes, and the United States' responsibility for and CIA's responsibility. They are obviously there, and they ought not to be forgotten, and there ought to be accountability for that, but that is not in the International Criminal Court.
I'll go to the next question, and it is from Mr. Clemens, our Executive Director. And
Mr. Clemens always asks difficult questions. I don't want to answer it.
So does the Geneva Convention on Treatment of Prisoners of War give that coverage to foreign mercenaries?
Mr. Clemens has a very good question. On mercenaries at the present time, what has really happened is that it has been not a recent phenomenon, but as it began, then began the effort in order to find some kind of legal accountability for that and how to deal with it. And they are not considered as prisoners of war. And for them at the present time, there has been an effort to put separately kind of legal norms for them, but they are not yet finalized.
Now, second question from Mr. Clemens is, what is the fate of POWs after the war ends? If they cannot be tried or harmed, then where do they go after actually the war ends? Are they to be freed? Where are they to be sent? What is their citizenship now, assuming that their country now has new rulers?
It's again, he's absolutely right in asking it. They are difficult questions. There is not a definitive answer to them, but under the legal setting, war ends, prisoners of war are free, and the point simply is, where do they go? Because the country where they belonged, does it accept them? Can they go to some other country? And those issues are still pretty much in fluid stage.
I think the adage there is that, one country's freedom fighters are other countries' foreign terrorists. So about the foreign mercenaries, whether they are mercenaries or they are terrorists, there will be questions. And I think the international law is very ambiguous about that. So that law is still need to be framed. I'll go on to the next question, and it is a very, very pertinent question. We have talked about, human rights violations, war crimes, effect of war on the environmental issues and degradation of environment. And the next question is from a person from Banaras Hindu University, Tanya, and she is asking question about the gender-based violence in Ukraine. Because in any war, the major vulnerabilities are that there's deepening of gender-based violence. There are some reports, so any comments on that particular issue?
Very pertinent question, and I think I probably did not mention, I should have mentioned. Crime against humanity includes gender-based, sexual-based crime. And that at the present time, the major tribunal that began the journey in that regard is the tribunal that was created on Rwanda, because their sexual crimes had been committed. And what that tribunal said is that that sexual crime, rape, is torture. It said rape is international crime. Rape can be tried as a major international crime. So there is absolutely no doubt that gender crimes are war crimes. Gender crimes are crimes against humanity, and gender crimes are to be treated exactly as other war crimes, and people who had committed those crimes to be held accountable, and absolutely no impunity for that at all.
So I'll go to the next question, which is not pertaining to human rights. It's more of a geopolitical question, so I'll leave it aside, but I will seek a clarification about, the international law about environmental crimes. There was use of depleted uranium shells in the Middle East by United States government. And there was blowing of an ammunition depot, and it's called Kamisia ammunition depot, that led to allegations of exposure to chemicals and Gulf War syndrome. To your, knowledge, has there been any international effort of polluting the environment by using depleted uranium shells? Because if we are going to, consider environmental degradation in the current war, has there been any precedent or any effort to bring that issue to justice?
Not yet. What has happened is that many, many years ago, the International Law Commission at one time said that environmental degradation ought to be seen as an international crime. And at that time, most of the countries refused to accept that. And so at this stage, absolutely no environmental damage by that or any other issue has been considered as an international crime. That is at the present time, hopefully after this Ukraine especially, that it will become an issue of concern, and issue of concern to the extent that some norms might be created, but at the present time, unfortunately, there isn't any. And so the United States was not held accountable, and other countries that have considered that, for example, what's happening in Syria, what Russia did, what the Syrian government has done. And it's not considered at the present time still a crime in the international arena. So we are at this stage pretty deficient in reaching out in the environmental area to hold accountable people who perpetrate those crimes.
So there is a question from Dr. Raghunath Chakrabarti. How much these types of wars between two countries have an impact on world economy, international trade, and foreign investments? Could that be an equivalent of war crimes? Just like we are talking about environment, we are facing a catastrophic food, crisis world over because of this conflict.
Very good. And I think this is at the present time simply in the realm of politics, because starvation is causing starvation. For example, at the present time, grains are not being exported from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Russia, and there is a possibility of even starvation. But unfortunately, there is no international criminal or international legal remedy for all that. It's simply a political remedy. But on that part, simply as in the environmental area, international law is pretty deficient. I think we need to understand one thing about international law. There are 193 countries, all of them, each one of them, jealously guarding its own sovereignty. None of them willing to have any third party decision maker finally take out any issue and decide it. International arbitration in that setting between states is not at the present time very healthy. So the point simply is that all these 193 prima donnas, each one at the present time jealously guarding, as I said, their own sovereignty. So international law is simply horizontal. It's not vertical. It's not the law that's, for example, at the present time promulgated by the United States Congress. Everybody has got to follow it. A law or regulation adopted by a city, everybody has got to follow it. You've got a 30-mile speed, you go beyond that, you're fined. You can't go to a court of law and say, I don't accept that. That is the state at the present time of states. A state has to accept it. A state has to accept even the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. It can simply say, I don't accept it. You can't go to a judge, say, Judge, I don't accept your authority. I have not given my consent. In the international arena, a state has got to give its consent. So to find fault with international law or to find fault with the United Nations is not the answer. The answer is for each country, each person to look into the image, look into the mirror and see the image. That is the answer. Because the point simply is that until that culture of peace prevails, until we have created that kind of consciousness that people and countries accept that kind of international norm, that there is something beyond their own simple, very, very strongly at the present time protected, and that is called quote unquote sovereignty. And there is no way that they are going to give it up. So there is no international government, there is no international norm that is accepted. Customary international law against state practice. Treaty, you have got to give explicit consent. So that is the state of the law. I think until now, in the international arena, violence has been endemic. Anytime a country felt hurt, it could use simply force. There was absolutely no limit to it. Gradually, some limits are being created. Some rule of law is being set. Some norms are being accepted. I think we have got to go a long way and we need to accept that.
So we have two last questions. And after that, we will end this session. So first question is Mr. Clemens, and that is the status under international laws and treaties of impact of unilateral economic sanctions on the population covered. It's happening in this instance. And if I may add that there is an instance that 500,000 of Iraqi children died because of unilateral sanctions in an unjust war in Iraq that were promulgated by the Bush administration. So what is the international law saying about genocidal impact of selective unilateral sanctions that are not accepted internationally on the covered population?
Do you want me to answer in a nutshell? None. What has happened is that from the very beginning, the thought was that you cannot use force against, and this is the political setting, political independence, national sovereignty, no use of force. And the point then at that time came, what about these economic sanctions? What about all these economic action taken that also has a great deal of impact and impact indirectly even on sovereignty, impact indirectly even on the country's own very existence. And the answer at that time was that at the present time, in international law, we've got no answer. There is no accountability, and there is a total ambiguity on it. And again, the point simply is that think about you're sitting in this country and Wild West. And in that Wild West, you came as a law abiding person and you came as law enforcement person and you went into a saloon and there are all those rowdy people and here comes the law and everybody laughs at the person. That is the present setting in the international arena. Will it change? In the national setting, it has changed, but it has taken hundreds of years. In the international setting, simply remember, it was total anarchy. Anybody could use force, and that was simply accepted as a fact. Today, at least, we're asking questions. We're at least challenging about these war crimes, crimes against humanity. There was nothing like that. What happened in my own country? No one in the world could do anything. I could treat my citizens any way I want. If I kill them and there is no effect upon the international community, nobody can say a word to me. So I think the change is very gradual. And human beings, I am totally impatient, as are you, but miracles don't happen every day.
So the last, it's almost like it's a query and it's from me. I think it's a good idea that environmental degradation secondary to war interventions should be considered as a war crime. There's no settled law there. Now, environmental degradation takes time, the impact. Limited wars may or may not lead to any environmental degradation. If we are going to put responsibility of environmental degradation in the warring situation on warring parties, what about those parties that prolong the war unnecessarily and artificially? Should they have culpability by prolonging the war, a war which could have been decisive in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if there are non-state actors, if there are other entities that are deliberately prolonging the war and thereby degrading the environment, should they have culpability in any international law? That is yet to be formulated.
Aditya, that will again take time. At the present time, no. But should it be? That's again people like you, philosophers, thinkers, that is their job, and be innovative and compel them to look into those issues that they haven't given a great deal of thought to. So, on that happy note, let's conclude it.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Nanda, for your, uh, you know, presentation on human rights violations in Ukraine. Uh, I must say that it is a very serious topic, and all of us had learned quite a lot from your presentation as well as questions and answers. Uh, being for human rights means being for human rights of all. In the International Commission of Human Rights and Religious Freedoms, we say that we don't look at rights of selected set of individuals or selected countries. We look at culpability of each and every entity, each and every nation, each and every person if they are violating the human dignity. And I think there are a lot of unsettled issues here in this sphere. So we had a very wonderful discussion about issues that are settled and issues that are not yet settled and are contributing to, degradation of human life, degradation of environment. And I think International Commission for Human Rights will continue to work towards upholding the human rights of vulnerable populations wherever they might be and whatever their creed might be, whatever their orientation might be. Our effort is to have a universal approach and balanced approach rather than selectively be influenced by one party or the other. So with those comments, we are ending this session. My thanks to Professor Nanda for taking his valuable time off. And my thanks to all our audience on a Saturday morning from here in United States and from India. Everyone took time off and participated in this challenging discussion. It's a challenging discussion. For our audience, the entire recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website and would be uploaded on our social media handles. With those comments, I am ending this session with thank you.
Arjunji, my apologies, but I do want to thank people because I'm just looking at the chat and there are many, many valuable comments and there are very many. My deep gratitude to each one of them who has been very kind to say that it was a good discussion and they learned a lot. So thank everyone in the chat box. And as you rightly said, thanks everyone for coming. And Atitinji, thank you very much finally for putting it all together. My sadhar namaskar to everyone. Thank you.